Who the fuck are you?
Guardians Crusade was a bit of a personal journey for me as a man. It's a game about trying to keep a bitch happy, and no matter what you do, it's never good enough. But outside of that, it's a fascinating JRPG, which stands out due to some unconventional design and a healthy amount of trope subversion. The Japanese release was dubbed Knight and Baby, which is quite literal given that it features a knight and a baby. Yeah, good job. The English title is more of a play on words, as the name Guardian implies that the knight's both a protector of the lands as well as a parental guardian. I don't know about the Crusade part. So the game opens with a cinematic of a baby burdened stork being stalked by demons and then jolted with a bit of lightning. Instead of disappearing into a crimson vapor, he simply loosens his grip on the newborn, dropping it to its ostensible demise. Hard cut to a snoozing protagonist copping a rude awakening from his fairy companion. She informs the hero that he's been summoned by the leader of the town, and after some sass-filled dialogue, the adventure just kinda begins. I love when games, and especially JRPGs, thrust you into the world immediately. There's no 30-minute long cutscene full of expository bloat before you can even start playing the fucking thing. It's almost like it's not a movie. Despite the lack of a traditional story presence, speaking to NPCs paints a more detailed picture, which is great because it's optional. Characters in the early town speak of a food drought, which is the catalyst for the entire journey, and seems like it'll be a fairly prominent theme, but it's almost immediately forgotten about once Knight starts babysitting. Returning home from investigating the Great Tomato Displacement, you stumble upon a baby monster who looks like chewed gum chilling outside the town, and then an angel rocks up and tells you to take him to a holy tower. Consulting with the mayor yields a much better plan, however. Dump him in a cave and let God sort him out. And that's exactly what you do. I genuinely lost my shit at this. Like, a JRPG protagonist agrees to abandon a helpless creature in a cave full of monsters after an angel literally descends from the heavens and says specifically for him to help the baby or the world will end. That's brilliant. I don't think there's anything wrong with tropes in JRPGs. They're one of the big reasons I live and breathe the genre, but when a convention flip is successful, it pays off in spades. And this is far from the only trick Guardians Crusade has up its sleeve. So after a couple of guilt-inspired nightmares, a guilt-inspired knight defies the mayor and tracks down Baby, only to find him being snacked on by a bird. Thus begins our epic journey. There's a distinct lack of major story events in the early to mid-game, but dungeons have smaller narrative threads weaved in, and the way they're kinda drip-fed keeps you far more invested than a standard bloated narrative. With that said, the delivery's a little too reserved, and if it were actually water and not just a poor analogy, you'd be a thirsty gamer boy. One such event sees the monotone protagonist searching for a lost child. It turns out that the child had made friends with some guardian monster who was entirely harmless, so Knight promises to leave him alone as long as the child returns home. A separate party of 3 heroes, who were also on the case, rock up and kill the guardian, under the assumption that he kidnapped the kid, completely ignoring her pleas to the contrary. This scene is one of those moments where the futility's paraded in your face, and it's propped up by the mandatory unwinnable encounter, which makes the slapping much more raw. The antagonistic group consists of a paladin, mage, and a cleric. Because of their frequent run-ins with the protagonist and their fairly generic party makeup, they exist as a lens through which you view a standard RPG journey. They're the typical happy-go-lucky heroes who set out to save the world from the ultimate evil, and along the way meet with kings, kiss babies, and slowly become corrupted by their secretly evil mage. Wait, hang on. Seeing that genre staple from the outside and then having it slowly corrupt is one of the best things Guardians Crusade does. It plays with the idea of how heroism can accompany a blind commitment to justice, which can be exploited by bad actors, and while not wholly original, it's quite well done, especially for a game with such a shallow story presence. Outside of the main events, there's a bunch of side quests which can be effortlessly passed over if you're not paying attention and speaking with NPCs. When the big bad becomes unchained, demons invade a bunch of towns from earlier in your journey, and as far as I can tell, clearing them out is optional. They infest the streets and are visible as you're flying around the world map, as well as walking past the afflicted towns. The models might look a bit shit, but you're gonna get that with the girthy use of 3D in a PS1 game, and it's easy to forgive, as visual design like this is a great way to not only convey urgency, but also to unintrusively alert the player to optional content. A design element I adore from older games is that the developers weren't desperate for the player to experience every single thing, and would often hide cool shit in such a brutally cryptic fashion that it would remain undiscovered for decades after release. It can be a double-edged sword, however, as the intent to hide things can be mistaken for poor guidance, which this game's a little guilty of. Assuming I'm not mistaken. There's plenty of side shit that could've used a bit more guidance, and stumbling upon it was like finding a needle in a haystack. Throughout your journey, certain NPCs will inform you of a cultist church which has been slowly infiltrating many of the towns. It's possible to interact with a handful of cultists spread throughout these areas, but nothing really comes of it. That is, until about halfway through the game, when a certain NPC will give you a brief background on the cultists and effectively paint their church as an orphan creator. It's only at the end of the game where you'll be able to raid the place, find out their true intentions, and free some of the mind slaves from what appear to be literal demons. While there's little directing you back to the specific towns in which the events occur, these scenes serve as a neat little reward for a thorough sweep of the game before you take on the final boss, and there's nothing quite like dismantling cults in JRPGs. Except for new clothes. As a part of the story, you're tasked with finding the Holy Armor, which is to be worn by the Chosen One. Knight ends up collecting the pieces on behalf of another character who believes himself to be this Chosen One. Upon acquiring all the parts, it turns out that he's too big for the armor, so you adopt the role of Holy Hero because you're a twink. It also comes with a new look and a new attack combo, which don't seem to have any effect. They're purely a visual element, but it is a welcome upgrade and one that really makes you feel like Spider-Man. I love physical and behavioral upgrades in video games, even if it has no mechanical function, because it can do a lot for character building. It gives a better sense that the character has actually been through some shit that had a profound effect on them, instead of simply being told that they've changed. Unfortunately, as much as Guardians Crusade differentiates itself from the standard JRPG, the final boss is a generic slog. It consists of 3 iterations, which take place in some sort of dimensional vortex, and the first phase is contextual. It's a really underwhelming end to a game that tried to step outside of its box and deliver a unique experience. Although maybe at the end of the day, the thing you're expecting the least is the thing you should be expecting the most. Nah, that's gay. One of the most impressive parts of Babysitting Simulator is the fact that it's almost entirely 3D. It gets away with this by being rudimentary, but not to its detriment. Most of the assets consist of basic shapes and simple cartoony textures, giving it a safe but distinct look amid the majority of PS1 RPGs. It's often the case that two-dimensional games of the early 3D console era fare much better than their polygonal brethren, but Guardians Crusade holds up pretty well. I'm not going to say it looks as good as Breath of Fire 3 or even Breath of Fire 4, but it does okay. And it doesn't seem like it was held back too much by constraints either, as the environment is somewhat open. Each continent is entirely interconnected, as all towns and plains can be accessed and moved through without a load screen. The insides of houses and dungeons do require a cheeky load, but it's quite modest. When traversing over the ocean or through the sky, however, there's quite a significant wait time, both to board and to disembark the respective vehicle. The movement speed of each is also insultingly slow. Luckily, sailing's only required a handful of times, and flight is borderline redundant. A method of fast travel is unlocked at the same time you're given the ability to fly, and with how slow taking to the skies is, it's quicker to simply teleport throughout the world, which is where you'll find one of the core gimmicks of Guardians Crusade, the living toys. Was that like the world's best segue or what? The inclusion of these toys is interesting, because in combat, they're really just colourful stand-ins for party members, magic, and summons, while out of combat, they gatekeep standard functions in order to justify their existence. So, to look at the world map or to teleport out of a dungeon, you use a specific living toy that has that required effect. There's nothing necessarily bad about this, but it does seem like it's stripping core functions of a standard JRPG and imprisoning them behind a gimmick. If it stopped there, the worst I could fault it for is adding an extra menu interaction, but much like a tax-burdened cam girl, some of the toys are very well hidden. A small number are given to the player via NPCs, but a large majority of them are found within chests scattered throughout the world. Because the game takes place in a 3D environment, it's much easier to hide these chests in plain sight by slapping them behind a wall and hoping the perspective will do the rest. I hate speaking on behalf of a development team, and I try very hard to avoid it, but it's pretty clear that they expected people to move certain ways throughout the dungeons and hid chests in obvious blind spots. I love when you're heavily rewarded for something so simple as rotating the camera every so often, but with how critical some of the toy functions can be, or rather how annoying the game is without them, it's a bit too harsh of a penalty. Dungeons largely consist of caves and caves, with a spattering of cave in there for good measure. It's odd though, despite the dungeon variety being somewhat low, the caves never overstayed their welcome. I'm gonna stop saying caves now. There are a couple of variant dungeons towards the end of the game, and their design's largely the same outside of the visuals. They're all fairly condensed and focused, and even with encounters they waste very little time, and are typically packed with goodies. Unlike the dungeons, towns are quite empty. They're designed like a real town instead of what's convenient for a hero's journey, and there's usually more than an inn, a shop, and a plot house. This gives you a lot to explore, and despite the low yield of goodies and the generally redundant nature of a lot of the houses, it adds a certain charm to the game that isn't found within many others of the genre. Outside of these hollow townships, the world map and, caves are packed with giant sperms floating around, and touching them initiates combat. They track to the night unless you're a big strong boy, in which case they'll flee. If you look closely, you can actually see that their eyes are different colours based on how they'll respond, and that's a really cool addition. Physical encounters being avoidable with swift movement is a fantastic feature, but what isn't so great is when a narrow corridor is packed with 3 of the bastards and it becomes impossible to avoid a tussle. You might as well just have a mandatory encounter at that point, because it serves the same purpose, but doesn't belittle the aforementioned visual and behavioural tells. Combat itself is turn-based, and oddly enough, not dependent on speed, you just go turn for turn. It's a bit slow because PS1 RPGs had this measuring contest where they had to flex their newly acquired Z-axis, however, there's an option to make it go twice as fast. This is fantastic, but if the devs knew their combat was slow, why not speed it up in a more natural way by removing bloated animations instead of just a flat doubling of speed? I mean, this is a major nitpick and it doesn't matter, but, it's better than nothing. So, encounters begin as a solo affair where the only ally is Knight. It's not too long before you get your other party member, Baby, but he's pretty useless at first. Up until you ditch him in a cave, he'll immediately flee every encounter, cementing the fact that he is indeed an infant. God, that makes the scene where you dump him and run that much worse, hey? After his brief stint as bird food, he comes back with a fiery vengeance, and what a vengeance it is. While uncontrollable, he can be ordered around with a list of commands, those being attack, defend, help, and run, but these are more suggestions than anything. The pink blob can also transform into a sword, a spider, a dragon, and all kinds of other cool shit, and he can be manually ordered to transform if you win the Secret Affection lottery. So Baby isn't simply a party member, you're also expected to take care of him in a vague, combat-driven kind of way, which involves interacting through an immeasurable, unexplained happiness system. Orders work more like a conversation instead of a way to control his actions, and if you fail to speak with Baby during every battle, he'll get lonely, ignore your orders, and straight up attack you. Other things that apparently make Baby mad are taking too long to heal him, taking damage at all, Baby losing all of his health, or taking too long to progress the story. While NPCs hint at the conversational aspect to baby care, I didn't even see a glimpse about any of the other shit. I had to look up an FAQ just to figure out why the little bastard was attacking me. I just assumed it was the whole cave abandonment thing, but we don't talk about that. I'm willing to concede that I may have missed something critical. JRPGs have a lot of dialogue, and it's a big job to take it all in, especially when most NPCs spout little more than filler. I still think it's sloppy having a fundamental mechanic that you can't peep, because then it becomes difficult to not only figure out that it exists, but also to measure the effect certain interactions have on it. In general, the combat difficulty is quite low, and I honestly think that the hardest part is attempting to make Baby like you. I spent half the game trying to win his favour, and I finally got to a point where he adored me. Then some story event stripped him away right before the end of the game, and when he came back, he fucking hated me again. It's a great concept in theory, but the execution was sloppy, and there's really no incentive to utilise it. You can also feed him items outside of combat, so I filled him with an inventory's worth of gum trying to clog his asshole and kill him, but it just made him happier. I do not get this parenting thing. Feeding the little shit swords and armor will occasionally increase his stats, but it seems like at a certain point there's diminishing returns, which prevents him from being overpowered. He can also fetch random items, but they're usually low-tier shit you can buy from stores, and that also makes him hate you, so it's not a good idea. Moving right along from Baby being a cunt, let's talk about the living toys again. The toys can interact with combat in one of two ways. Either they have an effect and immediately bugger off, or they plonk their ass down and stay for a couple turns. Single-turn toys seem to be usable multiple times throughout combat, but multi-turn toys can only be summoned once per battle. So effectively, these single turns are just like standard spells, and the multi-turns are like little temporary party members that only require a small dose of MP up front. If these short-lived allies take enough damage, they'll leave combat, despite not having a health pool and very rarely being targeted. Up to 3 can be summoned at once, and if you have a stacked field, you can no longer use any type of toy, even the single-turn ones. Despite being beyond fair, there's still incentive to not immediately fill up on temporary party members, as you'll be locked out of healing and occasionally useful auxiliary effects. Some of these include status ailments, which are actually useful, believe it or not. As your move pool is quite limited, even random battles can take a few good turns, and one major way to completely cheese this is with the toy Freud, who puts foes to sleep. As far as I could see, this works on every single non-boss enemy, which makes complete jokes out of the ones that are meant to be intimidating, as they harmlessly take up more screen real estate than what's on offer. It also kinda sheds some light on just how much work went into this title, as it seems like pretty much every foe has an individual sleep animation. There's a fair amount of enemies in Guardians Crusade, and sleep could just as easily have been signified with a couple of floating Zeds, but the absolute mad lads did it. On top of that, most of the enemies are unique in design, which I guess they had to be because of their simplistic constraints. Think about a game full of monster houses from Final Fantasy VII, and that's pretty much what we're dealing with here. The frame rate's also killer right up until the final boss, where it's a bit sluggish, but for the amount of 3D used, and with the ability to speed up battle, it's very well optimized. Oh no, I got sidetracked in a pre-written script. Let's talk about living toys again. So not unlike the toys outside of combat, those within can be completely useless. There's one that legit just narrates what's happening with a slow text scroll across the bottom of the screen. That's all it does. While there's really no point in using it, the vast amount of abilities these things offer encourage trying them at least once, because despite an often vague description, you'd never really know what you're in for. While the sleep toy was useless against bosses, summoning both the fire and wind elementals would drop the big boys quite fast. The allied slappers often stayed for the entire duration of the fight, and each blasted the enemy with their respective magics once per turn, effectively granting you 2 free attacks. Having these perpetual casters out also frees up Knight to be a dedicated healer, since your damage is constantly coming from elsewhere. I won't lie and say that they're anything close to balanced, or that a great care was taken in making each one unique and viable, but fuck, they're a spiffy idea. Outside of these, Knight can really only attack and use items. Elemental weapons are pretty much the only other factor that goes into building him, and incentivizing your regular attack over something else, but these seem pretty useless in the grand scheme of things. Overall, combat is way too easy, and between Knight, Baby, and up to 3 other toys, it generally boils down to an onslaught of hurt. For the enemy. And when the pink dickhead isn't engaged in friendly fire. To conclude, Guardians Crusade was a genuinely interesting, fresh experience. Due to the lack of balance and difficulty and Baby being an intolerable cunt, combat's a low point for sure, but it's made up for with some unique approaches to tired JRPG staples and features a lot of cool shit you don't see coming. It would have been sick to see a sequel or another game refine some of the ideas found within Guardians Crusade just to see how far they could push them, but it's been 20 years and the series is firmly dead. It's a bit of a shame, but, you know, that's life. As always, I've been Casp, and you're still here for some reason. Thanks for watching.